Hello and welcome to our webcast for January 24, 2020. Sorry for the dark. Okay. My name is Christian Debré and this is Amy Hasbrook, the director of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet.
Hello.
Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet is a non-religious organization by and for people with disabilities and our allies. We believe that the choice to die is not free as long as old, ill, and disabled people don't have the free choice in where and how they live, and that must change. Today's topics. A Quebec panel recommend euthanasia by advance request part 2. And the second one is update on the federal online MAiD survey. So Amy will help us through those subjects.
Okay, I'll do my best anyway. Okay, last week we talked about a report written for Quebec's Minister of Health and Social Services, which recommends allowing medical aid in dying, or MAiD, by advanced requests, even if the person has lost capacity to consent at the time. And today we're going to focus on the recommendations made by the expert group. The recommendations are meant to address the different kinds of situations where an inability to consent would prevent a person from getting access to euthanasia. So the first situation would be when a person who has made the request and the request has been approved, so everything's all set, and the person loses the ability to consent before the procedure can be carried out. So like if they're taking a pain medication that makes them sleepy or makes them unconscious, and they can't consent at the time of euthanasia, that would be this kind of situation. In recommendation number 1, the committee says that the person retains the right to receive medical assistance in dying. The recommendation seems to assume that the date of the euthanasia procedure is already decided, but it's silent on when the lethal dose will be given and how the decision will be taken.
Yeah.
So they're kind of making some assumptions, but they don't say how it's decided when this will all be scheduled.
They assume a lot of testing and ask and
make it ask you and me. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Another situation is a person who has not applied for medical assistance in dying and has a sudden loss of capacity, for example, after a stroke or a car accident. The panel says that person would not qualify for euthanasia. The experts encourage citizens to fill out advanced medical directives, which is recommendation number 6, which describe what life-sustaining treatments they want in case they cannot consent. The third kind of situation is when a person is diagnosed with a condition that will cause them to lose the ability to provide free and informed consent. That can make they can make an advance request for euthanasia while they are still capable. The request will be processed and the procedure carried out, quote, at the appropriate moment, unquote. This 2-step process is described in recommendations 3 and 4 and 7 through 10. And finally, recommendation 12 says that requests from people with cognitive deficits or mental illness who have never been deemed competent to make medical decisions should not be refused solely on the basis of their diagnosis. And we'll get to this in a minute, but Quebec has announced that they're going to make it open access for people with psychiatric disabilities.
Yeah, without consulting, without anything.
Yeah.
Go.
Yes.
Kill people.
So much for the democratic process,
yeah,
right?
So much.
Yeah. Recommendation 3 proposes that an advanced request for MAiD should be made, quote, after obtaining the diagnosis of a serious and incurable illness, unquote. The experts added this requirement to try to prevent people from seeking MAiD out of fear of the unknown. However, in practical terms, this may result in people deciding to die just after receiving a terminal diagnosis while they are still in crisis and don't know what it's like to have that disability.
Yeah,
And thus the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
yeah. Like you receive a stage 4 or 5 in cancer, you are in shock because I'm dying. Suddenly, I'm not suffering now, but I'm dying. Oh, I don't want to suffer. Kill me now. And sometimes people with stage 4 may live for 5, 6, 10 years.
Or even, it doesn't matter what stage of cancer you're at. If you get a terminal diagnosis, that's a shock.
Yeah.
And if you're afraid of what is going to happen,
Kill me now.
Right.
Pull me. But after 6 months and you're living well,
Right.
maybe you change your mind.
right,
But if you are already dead, difficult to do it.
right, exactly. Okay. Recommendation 4 describes the first step of the process. The advanced request must, and the form must be signed by the person in the presence of a doctor. The doctor also signs the form confirming the diagnosis of a serious and incurable illness, that the person has capacity to consent to care.
Yeah, but even so, doctor do mistake as every human.
Right. And that the person has the capacity to make an advance request. And also the doctor confirms that the consent is free and informed. And
Oh
again,
yeah, you know that. You know how you live in your home. You know that your family don't put any pressure on you. You know that you doesn't have any difficulty with finance and so on and so on. Oh yeah, sure, doctors do that.
no, it's the person has been informed
Oh.
of all their options. But of course, telling somebody that they have the option of something is not the same as actually having the option.
Yeah.
And of course, in Quebec, people don't really have much in the way of home-based services. So where's
And
the value of informing somebody?
even for palliative care, sometimes you could not have it
Right.
properly.
Yeah, we'll tell you that you can get palliative care, but whether you actually get it is another matter.
35 to 40 people right now, something like that.
It's a percent.
Yeah.
The advance request form must also be signed either before 2 witnesses or a notary. The notary is not required, and the experts say the experts don't say that the witnesses have to be disinterested or impartial. Also, speaking practically, how easy will it be to get a doctor and a notary in the same room to sign the form?
Be sure, it's difficult to get a notary, and it's very difficult to have a doctor. And difficult after difficult, good luck.
Yeah. Recommendations 7 and 8 allow the person to choose someone to start the processing of the advance request, quote, at appropriate moment, unquote. However, the experts don't say clearly how the appropriate moment is decided. The explanation of suffering in recommendation number 9 suggests the person will have written into their request some triggering condition or event, but the authors give no guidance on this question. So at some point, but we don't know how that's decided, or we know who decides it. Well, actually, we don't know who decides it because we know who announces it, but we don't know who decides it. So yeah, it's they, this is the kind of detail that they didn't include in the report, and it's really essential.
Yes.
Detail.
Even a small detail on the law could be very essential.
Right.
It changed all things. And be sure, a good lawyer will always exploit every comma, every mistake in the law. Loopholes,
Right.
we'll be fine.
Right. So they write this 173-page report and they leave out this, detail about,
Yeah,
gee,
detail.
how are we going to know when the person's
A big detail, not even a small one.
application will be considered? Committee emphasized that the third party is a spokesperson and not a substitute decision maker or guardian. Their role is only to inform the medical team, quote, that a euthanasia request exists and to ensure the request is duly considered, unquote. So that's their job, but we don't know at what point they're going to do that because we don't know the triggering event. If the person who made the advanced request didn't choose someone to trigger the approval process, or in the event of refusal, withdrawal, or impediment on their part, another person, quote, with an interest in the patient, unquote, or an impartial external authority can take on that role. But it's unclear in this sentence what the word refuse means. Does it mean, is it only about the person's unwillingness to perform the function overall, or does it apply if a person refuses to euthanasia approval because they believe the disabled person isn't suffering? We don't know. And that's a really important detail.
Yeah, another detail. A lot of detail in those things.
Right. I mean, if the person says, hey, this person isn't suffering at all, why should I, start this process? But the nephew who's going to inherit says,
Yeah.
well, I think really we should start this process, and goes to the doctor and says, start approving the process. I mean, that's not okay.
Always the nephew.
Yeah. Poor nephews. Okay. The goal is to act in the person's best interest. But who decides what that interest is, and how do they make that decision? We are afraid that such judgments will be swayed by negative views of life with dementia, which is pretty rampant in this report,
Yes.
as we talked about last week. Recommendation number 9 outlines the short list of eligibility criteria for approval of an advanced euthanasia request. So the person must be 18 years old and have health insurance. They must have a serious and incurable illness, which is marked by, quote, an advanced and irreversible decline in his capacities. And it's worth noting that the English term used in the federal law, which is grievous and irremediable medical condition, is stronger than the translation from the French to English, serious and incurable, of the phrase that's used in the French version of both the federal and the Quebec statutes, grave et incurable. So grave et incurable is lighter. It's not so strong as grievous and irremediable. But, oh well, the Quebec law actually came first, so.
Yeah.
As we described last week, the expert panel recommends a new and lower threshold for suffering, which is, quote, assessed by the doctor and the multidisciplinary healthcare team, and corresponds to what is expressed in the anticipated request for MAiD. So that's where we got that we were talking about earlier. So theoretically, it's going to be in the form, but again, 173 pages, they didn't bother to include anything more specific than that. And the standard has changed from unbearable suffering to significant suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's lower and lower always.
Yeah. And the standard is also changed from suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner the person finds tolerable to suffering that is difficult
Is
to
it
relieve.
not looking like a slippery slope?
Yeah. And finally, they have added the option that the person could be experiencing existential suffering.
So if it look as a slippery slope, if it smell as slippery slope, if it walk as slippery slope, it must be a slippery slope.
Must be a duck.
It must be a duck. Yeah, good.
Okay, on January 21st, Quebec's health minister announced that the, quote, end-of-life criterion will be dropped from the existing statute, and media reports later in the week said the province is planning to ask the Collège des Médecins to draw up guidelines for expanding eligibility to people who want euthanasia due to mental illness. So again, this is, this law was passed following a process of hearings in the legislature, and now they're just like changing it like that. And they claim they're going to have some kind of a consultation, but a consultation is not the same as a legislative process. And yet, Quebec claims to be a democratic society. That seems really...
Yeah.
And the federal government isn't any better. So, as with the federal law, the recommendations dealing with the second opinion or recommendation fails to say what happens if the second doctor doesn't agree that the person is eligible. In practice, this means that the primary doctor simply asks around until they find a second doctor who agrees that the person is eligible.
Is it not looking like doctor shopping?
Yeah.
Oh.
You need to wait until I'm done speaking so that people can hear.
Sorry.
Yeah. Recommendation 11 says that if a person is incapacitated, someone else cannot request euthanasia on their behalf. However, the authors say nothing about supported decision-making or any alternatives to guardianship. So, yeah. Okay, recommendation 12 states that respect for the equal rights of people with intellectual disabilities or mental illness require that requests for MAiD from these people should be assessed on the basis of their ability to consent to euthanasia and not on the basis of their diagnosis. The authors don't provide any guidelines for such assessments, however. So they don't say how. They say you need to have more rigorous guidelines because these people are potentially vulnerable, but they don't say what those guidelines are. Another detail that was left out of the 173-page report. I have to say, this report was, in my opinion, it was very badly written, badly organized. I found it very difficult to understand.
Is inconsistent exists?
Yep, inconsistent. Yeah. Okay, so the experts cite the Starson versus Swayze Supreme Court case, which established the right to refuse psychiatric medication, but they don't deal with the fact that while a person can always change their mind about taking medications, euthanasia cannot be undone. And
yeah, when you are dead, you're dead. It could not be.
Yeah, in law school, they taught us this thing where you're supposed to, when you cite a case, it's supposed to apply to have the same kind of situation. And the fact that this case is different in that respect means that it's distinguished and from the other one, and it doesn't really apply. And yeah, okay. The authors recognize that the stigma, discrimination, marginalization, oppression, violence, and abuse faced by people with intellectual and psychiatric disabilities has to be taken into account when evaluating euthanasia requests.
How they will be able to do that?
Right.
How? Just how?
However, they overlook the lack of community-based supports that force people into institutions. So they'll look at some of the discrimination, but not all of it.
Yeah. And even the one they have named, they did not have the capacity to assess it properly.
Right, exactly. It's because all of those are external pressures, but of course the definition of external pressure is only coercion by a relative, so forget that. The view seems to be that the people's decisions must be respected even if they're forced into choosing between two unacceptable options.
Yeah, to be abused or dead.
Right. Yeah. Okay. The authors cite a study on page 130 showing that almost 50% of people who are incapable of consenting to treatment are not recognized as such by the healthcare team following a standard clinical evaluation. So people do evaluations, but they don't recognize that the people are incapable of making healthcare decisions. But they mention the need for a more rigorous process because the decision to die is irreversible, and suggest keeping better in developing better tools for determining capacity. But again, they don't offer any specifics. And this seems like a pretty central thing to me, especially if we're talking about people with dementia. Recommendation 14 calls for better access to palliative care, but doesn't matter a free zone where people count on palliative care without having to worry about pressure to end their lives or accept continuous palliative sedation, etc., etc. And a couple of things to keep in mind about palliative care. One is that insufficient palliative care can worsen symptoms, causing loss of capacity. So, for example, agitation, pain, or depression. And on page 133, the authors finally admit that, quote, the ability to make a free and informed choice assumes that people have a full range of options from which to choose, unquote.
Yeah, but the range of options must be a bit larger than to be abused and to go to
Right,
be killed. Okay?
Right, exactly.
It must be quite a lot larger.
Right. Yet, in the same paragraph, they propose that in the absence of adequate end-of-life resources, a person who has the life expectancy of more than 3 months, who is losing autonomy, they're losing autonomy because of public policy, not because of their disability, and who is no longer able to return to live at home, could consider receiving MAiD. Well, that's like suggesting it.
So my mother, at 83 years old, suffering of difficulty to walk, great difficulty to walk.
Right.
She lived on the second floor, okay? And she need a scale escalator, so like a seat, something that they announce on the TV.
Stair lift.
Stair lift. If she buy it new, she is probably possible to get some kind of subvention, okay?
Grant or
grant, okay? But after 2 or 3 years of waiting, which my mother may be dead by that time,
right,
or not eligible, see if we try to get it used, but used you could not get any grant of any kind.
Yeah.
Nice, very nice. So maybe my mother will be forced in the institution, even if she had a very nice apartment, which she maintained perfectly, even if she had difficulty, but
right,
probably she will never return to her apartment.
At least not that apartment. We may have to find her another one.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and there you have the right to die becomes a recommendation to die, and how long will it be before it becomes a duty to die? Palliative care is suggested as the solution to caregiver stress and exhaustion, but personal assistance services are not mentioned. Again, because they didn't have any disabled people on their panel, so who would think of that? The expert panel pays lip service to disability rights by supporting the rights of people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness to be considered for euthanasia, just like everyone else, while ignoring the effects of systemic discrimination. The authors fail to wrestle with the questions that will trigger the processing of an evaluation request, of a euthanasia request, and continue the slide toward lax standards and broader eligibility. So that's all we have to say about that.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a short update on the Federal Online Medical Assistance in Dying Survey push poll. We wanted to give you a brief update on the process because there's been a lot of discussion this week on the interwebs about the problems of the online consultation survey. And some of those problems include, and I had to learn all of this in a day, less than a day. Plumping or poll crashing, which means overwhelming the site with responses from one side.
Yeah.
And that includes using automatic bots, robots, computers to answer the questions.
Or a group of people or different kind of
right.
Yeah.
Poorly worded and slanted questions, which we talked about last week, and a linear scale that is not actually linear. Usually a scale for rating the importance of something that goes from one to one extreme to another.
Yeah.
So for the scale for rating the importance of possible additional safeguards goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, no opinion. So usually people go 0 means not at all. And so you go to the other end because you want it a lot. Except if you check the last box, you're checking no opinion. And that's really, really sleazy in my humble opinion. Instead of using a straight
you could trick a poll like that by using that trick. You could do the either way. You could say no opinion at the first, so you trick it the other way.
Right.
But it's a trick.
Right. Exactly. In order to prevent the voice of disabled people from being lost, the activists with the Vulnerable Persons Standard, or VPS, are asking people to use the PDF survey form. Since you can fill it out multiple times, they don't seem to bother. 200,000, not a problem. And to email a copy to vpsstatistics@gmail.com. Despite the problems, it's important to give your opinion and to send a copy to the Vulnerable Persons Standard, folks. And the deadline, of course, is midnight at the end of January 27th.
So it's very, very soon.
Monday. So if you have any questions or want more information about what we have talked about here, you can see our text on our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujourvivant, not dead yet, all one word. Visit our website where you can view the video or read the text at tvndy.ca. You can email us at info@tv-ndy.ca, or you can follow us on Twitter @TVNDY. Thanks to Christian for helping out.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks to you for being there, and we will see you next time.
See you soon. Bye. Take care.